Hi, this is Women and Politics. The 18th century. Women were not present at the Continental Congress in Philadelphia in 1776, nor at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787. In March 1776, Abigail Adams wrote a celebrated letter to her husband John, who was serving as the Massachusetts representative to the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. She wrote, "I wish you would ever write me a letter half as long as I write you." So she starts out by saying, "You are not communicating enough. I hear that you have declared an independency." By the way, her word usage and her style of spelling, it's just a reflection of the 18th century style. It's not my misspellings and not my word usage. So I hear that you have declared an independency, and by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies, and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion, and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. She continues that your sex are naturally tyrannical is a truth so thoroughly established as to admit of no dispute. But such of you as wish to be happy willingly give up the harsh title of master for the more tender and endearing one of friend. Wow. John Adams replies, "As to your extraordinary code of laws, I cannot help but laugh. We have been told that our struggle has loosened the bonds of governments everywhere, that children and apprentices were disobedient, that schools and colleges were grown turbulent, that Indians slighted their guardians and slaves grew insolent of their masters. But your letter was the first intimation that another tribe, more numerous and powerful than all the rest, were grown discontented." He continues, "This is rather too coarse a compliment, meaning that men are tyrannical. I guess that's his sardonic turn of phrase. But you're so saucy, I won't blot it out," so he calls his wife saucy. "Depend upon it, we know better than to repeal our masculine systems. Although they're in full force, you know, they're little more than theory. We dare not exert our power in its full latitude. We are obliged to go fair and softly, and in practice, you know, we are the subjects. We have only the name of masters, and rather than give up this, which would completely subject us to the despotism of the petticoat, I hope General Washington and all our brave heroes would fight." Well, she would not leave this alone, so she responds to his response. "I cannot say that I think you are very generous to the ladies. For whilst you are proclaiming peace and goodwill to men, emancipating all nations, you insist upon retaining an absolute power over wives. But you must remember that arbitrary power is like most other things, which are very hard, very liable to be broken. And, notwithstanding all your wise laws and maxims, we have it in our power not only to free ourselves, but to subdue our masters, and without violence throw both your natural and legal authority at our feet." This seems like a empty threat, but okay. So how did women actually get political and economic power? This exchange that I read to you between Abigail and John Adams, it's just indicative of the fact that women had virtually no power, so she was reduced to writing these provocative letters. But that doesn't really change things. So what has changed things? I think it's the confluence of social movements that led women to acquire power. So by confluence, I mean the coming together, the merger of several movements at the same time. So first we have to define what a social movement is. A social movement is a type of group action that is focused on specific political or social issues. And a social movement aims to bring about or to resist change in society through collective action and campaigns. The objective or objectives of a social movement is, like I said, to bring about or to resist change. But in the context of women and politics, I think it was more about bringing change about rather than resisting it. A social movement is sustained over a long period of time, years or decades. So unlike most other forms of political participation that we already looked at in other lectures, a social movement is not intermittent. So if you talk about strikes, marches, protests, voting, all of those activities, all of those forms of political participation are intermittent in nature. Social movements are not. They're like a very long rolling wave that keeps just going and going and going. And so the nature is continuous and prolonged, and this is what builds the pressure up on the political system to eventually effect change. Social movements have varying degrees of leadership structure. The structure can be formal or informal, centralized or decentralized. Social movements also use a wide array of tactics. For example, they can employ more intermittent form of political participation for their purposes, like protests, strikes, and lobbying. So all of these can be used as just tools in the toolkits of a social movement. Social movements rely on a broader public, so they aim at mass participation. And this participation goes well beyond a small group of core activists or just members of a particular occupation, like journalists and judges. Over the past 2 centuries, women in the United States gained a lot of power as the result of a confluence of 4 social movements: the Abolitionist Movement, the Temperance Movement, the Suffrage Movement, and the Civil Rights Movement. So what are the approximate timelines? Just to understand it better, we have to put it in a historical context, and that includes trying to put some dates on each movement. And even though the dates are approximate, it's useful to still have some dates. So the Abolitionist Movement is the earliest one chronologically in this series of 4 movements. It can be traced back to the late 18th century, but it gained significant momentum early in the 19th century. So a practical endpoint is the end of the Civil War in 1865 and the passage of the 13th Amendment, the end of slavery. So roughly, we're talking about from 1800 to 1865 for the Abolitionist Movement. For the Temperance Movement, we can say that it started gaining traction in the early 19th century. The movement's major legislative success, the Prohibition, started in 1919, and it ended in failure in 1933 with the repeal of the 18th Amendment. So the movement lasted from, I would say, 1820 to 1933. Next is the suffrage movement. So in the United States, the women's suffrage movement began to organize at a national level in the mid-19th century with the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. That's often cited as really the starting point. The movement concluded with the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, which granted women the right to vote. So the timeline is approximately 1848 to 1920. The civil rights movement, so the modern civil rights movement is generally considered to have started in the mid-20th century, though its roots do go back further. A common time frame is from 1954 Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision, and through the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, up to the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. So roughly we are talking about from 1954 to 1968. All right, so the abolitionist movement is next. Women were quite active in the abolitionist movement because women felt affinity with slaves because of their social position. Married women often had no legal rights aside of those that they had as being married to their husband. So because of this, they felt politically and economically powerless. White women were quite active in the abolitionist movement, and they came out of the domestic sphere to work against the enslavement of others, while African American women spoke from their experience, bringing their story to audiences to elicit sympathy and action. Let's talk about Harriet Tubman for a few minutes, because I've discovered a lot of students don't know who she was. She was born in slavery in Maryland around 1822. Harriet Tubman escaped to freedom in Philadelphia in 1849. Underground Railroad conductor is her most famous role. After securing her own freedom, Tubman made numerous trips back to southern states, risking her life to lead scores of enslaved people, including her own family members, to freedom in the North. She became known as Moses for her leadership and courage. She was also very active in the abolitionist movement overall. She worked tirelessly for the abolition of slavery. She was a speaker and fundraiser for the abolitionist causes and worked with other prominent abolitionists like Frederick Douglass and John Brown. During the Civil War, Tubman served as the Union Army cook, nurse, and even a spy. She was the first woman to lead an armed expedition under the command of Colonel Montgomery in the war, guiding the Combahee River Raid, which liberated more than 700 slaves in South Carolina. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, who were two American activists in the abolitionist movement, found themselves on the outs with the rest of the movement because men thought that the presence of women in the movement might discredit the movement itself. So when they were attending the Anti-Slavery Congress in London, even though they were official delegates, they were not allowed to speak. And so this really provoked them to seek an additional way to effect social change, a way that was specifically feminist, let's put it this way. And applying the analysis of human freedom developed in the abolitionist movement, Stanton and others began the public career of modern feminists. So the Declaration of Sentiments in 1848 built itself on the Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, and the Declaration of Sentiments specifically states that all men and women are created equal. Next is the temperance movement. So the temperance movement was dedicated to modern and sometimes to moderation rather, and sometimes to complete abstinence from alcohol. The earliest organizations of the movement formed in New York in 1808 and in Massachusetts in 1813. Churches were active in the movement. By 1833, there were 3,000 local societies in the U.S. Some activists worked outside the movement, like the famous Carrie A. Nation, who lived from 1846 till 1911. She would sometimes break into saloons and destroy them with her hatchet. The movement had international scope, and it was characterized by organized cooperation of women. So women claimed, a lot of women who were in this movement claimed that the use of alcohol really hurt women and children more than people who drank the most, men. So men drank the most, but it was their wives and their kids who suffered from the aggression released by alcohol. So alcohol was bad not just for one's health, it was really undermining morality because it was provoking violence. It served as a catalyst for violence against women and kids. Next is the suffrage movement. So the United States obviously was not the first country to guarantee women the right to vote nationwide. That was New Zealand in 1893. However, even long before then, in the United States, an organized movement on behalf of women's suffrage, which was led by both men and women, already emerged, and that was around 1848. So first territories and states to grant, the earliest, meaning the earliest territories and states to grant women the right to vote, were Western territories and states, starting with Wyoming in 1869. So the thing was that for Western territories and states, you had a lot of free a lot of empty spaces, not free land, but a lot of empty spaces and a lot of land which could be bought almost for free. And a lot of single young males from crowded eastern cities, as well as from Europe, would come to the United States and would move west. And they were seen as a socioeconomic threat, as a distinct socioeconomic class by those who were already established in those areas. And the men were hoping that giving women the right to vote would balance out the presence of these new migrants to Wyoming, to Utah, Colorado, etc., because the thinking process was that women would vote the way their husbands would vote. So politically, men and women would create an alliance, a socioeconomic alliance against these poor, newly arrived single men of dubious background. So if you look at the chronology of which territories and states were the first, we saw that Wyoming was first in 1869, then Utah in 1870, Colorado 1893, Idaho 1896, Washington 1910, and California 1911. So we see it's all Western states and territories. So before the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, we already have more than a dozen states having granted women the right to vote. What about the situation with New Jersey? Some people claim, well, it really was New Jersey that was the first one to give women the right to vote and not Western territories. Well, here's what happened. New Jersey is a unique situation. Historically, its Constitution of 1776 extended the right to vote to all inhabitants of the state who owned a certain amount of property, including unmarried women and free people of color. So, yes, that was very unusual for the time anywhere in the world, as most voting rights were restricted to white male landowners. However, we have to keep in mind the situation changed in 1807 when New Jersey passed a law that explicitly restricted the right to vote for white male citizens, thereby revoking the voting rights of women and non-white men. So the distinction here is that New Jersey's initial inclusion of women in voting rights was not framed as a deliberate effort to advance women's suffrage, rather it was accidental. They overlooked it. And it was a byproduct of property-based voting rights rather than concern for women's rights. In contrast, what you have happening in Western territories is the genuine movement for women's rights, and specifically for the right to vote. And it gains a significant momentum, starting, like I said, repeatedly with Wyoming, Utah, and then Colorado. So while New Jersey did initially allow women to vote, it turned out to be a very temporary event and not a part of women's suffrage movement that characterized the efforts of Western territories and states. We have to say a few words, I think, about Susan B. Anthony. Everyone heard this name. Not everyone knows what she did, what she's famous for. So Susan B. Anthony was a relentless advocate for women's rights, especially the right to vote. She co-founded, along with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the National Women's Suffrage Association. The organization focused on achieving women's suffrage at the national level. Anthony was instrumental in organizing, strategizing, and participating in suffrage activities, including rallies, petitions, and lectures across the nation. Her constant campaigning contributed significantly to raising public awareness and support for women's voting rights. In a famous act of civil disobedience in 1872, Anthony was arrested for voting in the presidential election, challenging the laws that prohibited women from voting. Her trial and subsequent fine, which she refused to pay, got a lot of national attention and further highlighted the cause of women's suffrage. In addition to her work for women's suffrage, Anthony also advocated for other social reforms, including the abolition of slavery, women's property rights, and equal pay for equal work. Finally, in August of 1920, the 19th Amendment is ratified. Section 1 reads, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. And Section 2 says Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So let's talk about different kinds of power, political, economic. We'll start with political power. In 2008, we saw that a woman almost became the first woman to be nominated by a major party for president, and that was Hillary Clinton. In the end, she was stopped by Barack Obama. There was an interesting incident while she was campaigning. At one of the meetings, one of the rallies, there were two guys who stood up carrying a sign, and they started chanting, "Iron my shirt." And Hillary Clinton responded, "The remnants of sexism alive and well." And then some sources say that these guys just did it just as a gag, just for laughs, and they were not real misogynists. But whatever the case, that did highlight the idea that some people, as recently as 2008, were not really ready for a woman president. Then we had the first woman vice president. That, of course, is Kamala Harris. The two major parties did nominate women for vice president before. Republicans did so with Sarah Palin in 2008. Of course, she did not become vice president because John McCain lost to Barack Obama. And we had Democrats doing that even earlier in 1984, Walter Mondale and Geraldine Ferraro. And of course, because Walter Mondale lost, Geraldine Ferraro never became vice president. So Kamala Harris had the fortune to become the first woman vice president after Joe Biden ascended to presidency. So if you look beyond that, in 2023, there were 125 women serving in the House of Representatives. That's about 29% of the total. In 2023, there were also 25 women serving in the U.S. Senate, which is, of course, 25% of the total. If you look at state governors, as of 2023, there were only 49 women who have served as a state governor in all of U.S. history. Okay. In 2023, a record of 12 women were serving as governors, so 12 out of 50 states. That's a total of 24%. It's basically the same percentage, almost the same as the percentage of women serving in the U.S. Senate. The first woman was Governor Nellie Ross, who lived from 1876 to 1977. She won a special election for governor of Wyoming to succeed her deceased husband, and she took office on January 5th, 1925. So that's about 99 years ago. Miriam Ferguson, who lived between 1875 and 1965, won a regular election and became governor of Texas, taking office January 20 of 1925. And Miriam Ferguson also became the first woman to be elected governor to 2 non-consecutive terms. Economic and social power. So having the right to vote and the right to run for office, all of that is good and well. But if it's not backed up by economic and social power, then it's kind of hollow. Because, yeah, you can vote, but in the end, what do you gain if it doesn't translate into some economic gains in gains of social status, right? So let's look at how women struggled to gain entrance into prestigious and well-paying occupations. The case of Bradwell versus Illinois is one illustration of just that. Myra Bradwell tried to assert her right to be a licensed attorney in the state of Illinois by virtue of her status as a U.S. citizen. So she studied with a lawyer, as was frequently the case back then, and she passed her exam, but she was refused admission to the bar. In other words, the state refused to give her a lawyer's license, even though she was qualified. And that was frequently the practice at the time, that you didn't have to go to law school, although law schools obviously already existed by then. But many, if not most, people who became lawyers just studied with a lawyer and then would take their exam, and then would be granted a license upon passing it. But she wasn't, because she was a woman, and the Illinois State Supreme Court said, no, not going to give you a license. The court said, you do not have, under the 14th Amendment Privileges and Immunities Clause, you have no right to practice a profession. So the Privileges and Immunities Clause of the 14th Amendment states, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. So this was very narrowly defined in the slaughterhouse cases in 1873. Basically, these are the rights that you have as a U.S. citizen only, and not as a citizen of a state. It's like the right to travel the navigable waters of the United States, the right to travel between the states. But the court said this does not include the right to practice a lawful profession. But the Supreme Court, we are still at the state Supreme Court level. And the state Supreme Court said the strife of the bar would surely destroy femininity, meaning that law, being adversarial, rigorous, and stressful, was not suitable for women as a profession. Okay? So Myra Bradwell appealed to the Supreme Court of the United States, and not surprisingly, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled against her. So while the court agreed that all citizens enjoy certain privileges and immunities which individual states cannot take it away, it did not agree that the right to practice law in a state's court is one of those privileges and immunities. Like I said, privileges and immunities haven't been defined very narrowly. So this was the opinion of the court, delivered by Justice Miller. Justice Bradley, in his concurrence, went even further, and he cited the importance of maintaining the respective spheres of man and woman, with women performing the duties of motherhood and wife in accordance with the law of the Creator. Very interesting. Justice Bradley himself came from a huge family, very poor family of farmers, very humble background. But because of his efforts, he ascended really to the heights of political power. Nevertheless, his own experiences did not make him more sympathetic towards the attempts of women to better themselves and to ascend to a higher social standing through their intellectual efforts. So this, you might think that this would be someone who would be sympathetic, but he still was, in a sense, a prisoner of his own time, the social norms of his time. Women in higher ed. So as of spring of 2023, roughly 58% of college students were women. So while higher ed has its problems, as I mentioned in the video on higher education, because it's too expensive, it misallocates skills and majors and training, it creates too many majors in occupations for which there is no sufficient demand, and too little in occupations for which there is very strong demand. So despite all of these very real problems that higher education has, it does serve as a crucial avenue toward economic and political power. I know that people always bring up, Bill Gates and Michael Dell, college dropouts who went on to become billionaires. These cases are very real, but they're also very few compared to the population as a whole. So higher education still remains important as an avenue for success, and more women attend colleges and universities than men. This has been true for a long time now, and if this continues, we will see an even greater shift of power away from men and toward women. Women as full-time faculty, about 45% were full-time faculty, of all full-time faculty were women as of 2019. So this figure represents a significant increase over a period of several years. Women as college and university presidents, as I mentioned before, in the lecture on high ed, college and university presidents tend to be very well remunerated, not to mention very powerful, at least as far as running their own institutions is concerned. So women hold approximately 33 percent of all college and university presidencies. For instance, there are still disparities in terms of the prestige of these institutions. If you look at community colleges, women make up 43% of all presidents, compared to only 29% at doctoral institutions. Doctoral institutions are the ones that grant doctoral degrees, like PhDs. Women as CEOs. So when I was born, there were no female CEOs of the Fortune 500 companies ever in American history. The first one ever was Katharine Graham, who became CEO of the Washington Post Company in 1972. So the first one was 72. By 2023, 10.6% of all Fortune 500 companies are led by women, a total of 53 out of 500. So you may say, well, that's not a lot. That certainly is much more of an imbalance than you get in presidents in higher education. And yeah, you would be right. But still, I mean, if you look at the last 50 years, that's slow, but still steady and significant change. Women as billionaires, everyone likes to know about billionaires because it's so extreme. It's sort of the upper class of the upper class. It's not even top 1%. It's a tiny fraction of 1%. But it is indicative of some of the economic power that women have. As of 2023, there are 60 women who are part of the Forbes 400 list of the richest Americans. That's 15% of the total. Combined, these women have wealth of $621 billion. In a global context, there are 337 women billionaires. That's as of 2023. Specifically in the United States, around 13% of all billionaires were female as of 2022, out of a total of 735. As of 2023, in the world, there were 2,668 billionaires. Among them, 337 are women. Now, I do feel that we have to come back to earth as we reach the end of this video, because we've been talking about positions of high visibility, prestige, and in most cases of high earnings. Most women do not aspire to become chief executive officers of the Forbes Fortune list, nor do they inspire to become college or university presidents or to become billionaires. And even if they did, statistically speaking, these positions are not open to the vast majority of people out there. So when feminists, when advocates of progress or equality, or as they call it today, equity, which really means justice, and I think that's somewhat of a misuse of the concept equity, because justice doesn't necessarily mean equality. But put simply, when advocates of equality today focus on these facts, billionaires, CEOs, university presidents, they really miss the bigger and more important picture. And that bigger and more important picture is the lives of ordinary women. Not to mention men as well, but that's a separate thing. That's a separate video of how the lives of men have changed with the ascension of women toward more power and more money. But if you look at ordinary women, especially women who are in the bottom 25-30%, the millions and millions and millions of women who greatly outnumber the CEOs and the billionaires and university presidents, there is no really focus on them when you try to go for the top and focus on the top. What's happening at the top positions? What about the balance, the equality at the very top? Well, what about the justice for those who are in the lower 25-30%? Women who are single mothers experience particular hardship, economic hardship, and particularly challenging life. So their socioeconomic status is often overlooked in this race, which is stimulated by the media to create equality at the very top. 25% of families are headed by a single parent in America today, and about 80% of these single families are headed by single mothers, and about 20% by single fathers. About 21% of all children live with single mothers. And if you look at how well single mothers fare economically, it's not very well. So poverty rate for households that are headed by a single mother is 30%. For a single father, 17%. For families that are headed by cohabiting couples, 16%. But families that are headed by a married couple, only 8%. So the disparity could not be more stark. Single mothers have a poverty rate, household poverty rate, which is almost 4 times greater than the household poverty rate of married couples. So this is a brief overview of the struggle of women through history for power and socioeconomic status, and some of the basic facts of how they're doing with regard to both of these today. Thanks.